Hello and welcome to this short flipped classroom on digitally enabled social change. As you know, we're going to meet in the interactive classroom on Friday. So here I'm just going to summarize very quickly the main points in the Earl and Kimport book. Okay, let me get the video going. So, the aim of the lecture, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the differentiation of immobilization, e-movement, and e-tactics. Now, because they do base their research on e-tactics, and I think it's important to know what they are talking about when they do their research. And then, the main argument is the different affordances they believe the internet has brought with it when it comes to web activism. And these are also the ones that you're going to work with in class on Friday. So we'll talk about what you have to do, what I want you to do before you come to class, think about some examples, and then what we're going to do in the classroom. And then I will also talk a little bit about what they mean by Theory 2.0 and supersizing theories when it comes to web activism. So it's totally based on the book here, Digitally Enabled Social Change, and here you have them, Jennifer Earl and Katrina Kimport. So let me continue here. So with immobilizations, Earl and Kimport, they mean these kind of hybrid movements where activists use online tools to facilitate offline protest. They mobilize activists by using online tools, hence e-mobilizations. And this also taps into this argument of hybridity that some of you have heard me talk about before, how offline and online intersects in interesting ways, and you talk about hybrid media systems. Now, this is different from e-movements, which, according to their classification, doesn't have this hybrid quality, or not as much, at least. And they clearly differentiate e-movements from old time social movements. So unlike offline social movements, long-term activists who have shared an extensive political background is no longer needed. So the idea that you have to have a political identity, a political background, and a lot of things in common and shared is not as important any longer when it comes to web activism. And the argument here is that online tools offers inexpensive opportunities for organizers and participants that would not have come together if not for the web. And this is an argument that they build upon later in their work. They're using this metaphor of cost and low cost, and that it's inexpensive, meaning that it's easy. It doesn't cost as much in effort to organize, to come together, to find like-minded, etc. And then what they label e-tactics, which is kind of a mix between the two, e-mobilizations and e-movements. So they define this as instances of collective action with varying degrees of offline and online components, and varying degrees of affiliation with social movements. So examples here are online petitions and boycotts, etc. And they base most of their own research is mostly in these e-tactics domain, so to speak. And I think this is important to keep in mind when we look at their results, even though they make wider claims on web activism as such. So, but the bulk of the book deals with the affordances of the internet. They make a difference here between the web and the internet. The web being the content online, and the internet being everything from protocols to algorithms, etc. But what they focus on is the affordances of the internet for activism. So what do they mean by affordance here? Well, um, affordance is a type of action or characteristics of action that the technology enables through its design. I mean, as you see in the picture here, if you have a door with a handle, the affordance is to pull the door. Huh? That is the type of action that that enable the technology, well, the thing here, the door enables. But if you just have some kind of plates, I mean, the action that it affords is to push, yeah? To push the door. And it's the same with digital technology. It affords certain behaviors or push for certain behaviors. I mean, I've been talking about disciplining in my articles that we have talked about before, and this is another way to for Erling Kimport to get out of this technological deterministic argument saying that the internet automatically will lead to certain behavior, this kind of causality, giving room for the actor. I mean, even though there is a handle in the door, you could perhaps do something else with it. So it leaves room for the individual agent, but at the same time, it clearly pushes behavior into one way. So this is affordance. On page 32, they have this more elaborate definition of affordance: actions and uses that the technology makes qualitatively easier or possible when compared to prior like technologies. So this is what they mean with affordances. So what type of affordances are then internet enabling here or pushing for, or when it comes to activism? Well, mainly there is two affordances, or four. You can divide them into two because they talk about organization and participation, even though sometimes this organization and participation overlaps, but two or four affordances. So yes, they use this metaphor of cost here. So they argue that the internet reduces the cost for participation and organization, and this is important for activism. So if we look here, this reducing costs for participation, so they, which they have a whole chapter on in the book, very briefly summarized here. So they argue here that people don't have to come together physically, and time becomes less important for participation for participation here. So therefore, the cost or the effort to participate in activists demands or activist protests or things like that becomes easier. Hence, they say the cost is reduced. Uh, but not only it's easier, they also argue that the risk of what they call punishment here or is decreasing online. And with punishment, they mean, for example, loss of income. That you don't have to, you can be an activist in the sense that you can participate in many different actions online without having to not go to work, for example. You don't have to have as much time as you did before the internet if you're going to be serious about your activisms. And they also talk about stigma in a couple of times of the book, that the idea that going to protest events, being then associated to a larger group of activists, um, for example, yeah, I mean, it could be anti-fascist activist or perhaps neo-nationalist activist. It would lead to a certain stigma. Like if you were not really hardcore identifying with these groups, you would not go there. Here they argue the internet is reducing this kind of stigma. You don't have to be seen among this crowd, and it's not as important. Well, it's important, but it's not as important um, for your identity. It's not as for the image of you are, and it doesn't leave such much traces on you if you engage in an activist participation online compared to offline, they argue, hence the decreasing stigma. It's easier to mobilize, stand by activists and create bridges. Yeah, we talked about this in my article in First Monday here about the activist capitals. Um, with the internet, you can create bridges between activist groups. These citizens that are not that are following certain threads online, they are easier to mobilize. These who are not perhaps the most active, the more peripheral activists who are there standby seeing what happened, they are easier to mobilize. So this may lead to 5 minutes of flash activism. The smaller type of activists may surge and then diminish. And very interestingly, they also argue that since this you don't have to be so involved. I mean, this lowering threshold or this lowering cost of participation, that it's easier to participate online, also leads to a whole new range of topics around which people participate. And here they argue that the private passions or interest in that you have in the private realm becomes more accentuated with the internet here, and people to rally around these things than before, when it was harder to or costed more, to use their metaphor, to participate in activism, activist protest demands and things like that, um, tended to be more public and more larger ideological issues. Now, private passions are more perhaps not dominant, but it's more common to organize around private passions. But do web pages take advantage of this, or activist groups using the internet take advantage of this? No, they argue. You could make advantage of these affordances even more. So this is why I also want you to work with these affordances, because I think knowing how the internet works and about their affordances will make you much better communicators and internet communication PR agents, etc. So we can be much better. Activists, communication agents, or whatever can be much better in taking advantage of this affordance, they argue. So continuing to organization here, reducing cost for organization, they argue here that scaling up is cheap and initial starting costs are cheap. So what do they mean by this? I mean, this is, by the way, a whole another chapter in the book. Scaling up, to scale up an activist. I mean, if you perhaps start a protest event and then more and more people want to join, that could be very easy. And the initial starting cost, you don't have to put so much efforts or into actually starting something. And then if it takes off, kicks off, spreads, it's easy to scale up. I mean, I'm thinking about this It Gets Better campaign where one man in the US were basically starting a YouTube campaign with people, and then after that, celebrities, politicians, talking to gay kids that it might feel difficult now, but it gets better, to combat the high rate of suicides among homosexuals. So, and this was one person who started this, and then it kicked off, it spread off, and more people joined, and that was not difficult. So this leads also to what they say, that what they argue is that the need for an actual organization or an actual movement's decline. And they even have, one of the headlines is actually organizing without organization, even though later in the book they argue that yes, you need some kind of organization. So they are a little bit, they are not coherent completely here throughout the book, but clearly they argue that the need for an actual organization or a real social movement is becoming less important. You don't really have to have this huge organization behind you in order to start protest event or start a campaign. The internet also makes it much easier to market protests, expand the reach and the speed of communication. Um, well, I mean, we've talked about this connective individualism and the internet that is built on connections, etc. This makes it easier to then spread, broadcast an event among your connections, and then also mobilize standby activists, etc. So the internet makes it easy to market, to broadcast. I mean, I think this is interesting. The internet makes it easy to broadcast, but we were going around broadcasting with the internet. But since we collect connections online and we are friends with so many in our Facebook profiles, Instagram accounts, Twitter, it becomes easy to spread information to our selected peers in our network about the campaigns we're participating in. And interestingly here, they also argue that collaboration and social production increase. So even though actual organizations and movements are on the decline, they argue, well, are not as necessary any longer for orchestrating a campaign, still collaboration and social production increases among these more loosely connected individuals who then come together in a demand and then disappear. So these kind of flash 5-minute activism, their collaboration increases, and the production of sociality, they argue. Organizing becomes more varied and may include even parties of one. Yes, so you might not be so dependent on an actual organization, and you can also be one person starting in a campaign. I mean, this gets better example I just cited. So the other affordance here that they argue for is the shift of the declining need to be present at the same time in order to participate and organize a protest event or some kind of activism. So the ability to aggregate people's individuals' active actions into collectives without requiring co-presence in time and space. So we can collect people in actions, individual people who can act in some kind of coordinated way. I mean, they tend not to like the word collective. They talk about coordinating action instead of collective action, but in some kind of collective coordinated way without having to be there at the same time or in the same space. I mean, this space here, we're talking about space in a very geographical sense. I guess place would be a better word here, because of course you need to be on the same social media platform or digital platform to act, but you don't have to be in the same geographical space. So when it comes to participation, then people can act and coordinate actions without being co-present. They don't have to be in the same place, geographical place, even though they have to be on the same platform. And once again, they go on about this we-ness versus stigma, that this strong sense of we-ness that was so important before becomes less important. And this is also important for what they say before could deter people from participate, this kind of stigma that comes attached to you when you start walking a protest against something in a manifestation on the street, that you have to be so associated with this group that it becomes a stigma, perhaps, that this disappears. And very interestingly, they also argue that they see what they call, well, collective. I mean, they don't really like collective. They prefer coordinated action instead of collective action. So they talk about collective action without collective identity. Well, this is actually one of the major threads in Sylvain's dissertation. I'm sure he's going to talk a lot about it when he talks about Anonymous, because this is a group that is based online, but it has a very strong sense of identity. So can you then have a a strong sense of collective identity if you only exist online. Now, this is Sylvain, but what Erlang Kimper says that, you don't need collective identity. Collective identity is not important. You can have collective action anyway. Now, it all depends on how you define identity. I'm not sure I completely agree, but they are very loose on their definition of identity, so I don't really know what they mean here. But I mean, they are against this whole idea of collect. I mean, they don't want to use this word even. They talk about, coordinated action instead of collective action. And then when it comes to organization here, well, there is less people needed when organizing an action or a campaign. You don't need to be as many online to get your voice heard and to get through to the bus. I mean, if you know how things spread, this they don't talk about in the book, how to make, be successful campaign in terms of spreading and virality. But you could it's Get Better was a very successful campaign, yeah. And it was one person, and then it was scaled up with many people, and Barack Obama was also posting in comments, etc., etc. So organizing becomes a coordination phenomenon rather than a collective one. Well, we recognize that argument from the participation slide just before. It's not so much about being collective, it's just to coordinate. And they also argue that leadership is less important, that you don't really need to have a leader anymore. This I might be somewhat skeptical myself to this argument. Yes, in a sense that the strong leader perhaps is not as important, but as my First Monday article, I guess clearly showed, I hope clearly showed, is that there's still hierarchies in these protest groups. Perhaps less and more subtle, but there are still hierarchy. The internet makes it easier to find like-minded, of course, over geographical distances. And they argue that this sporadic, episodic, and periodic organization will become more common, that people come together for a little thing, perhaps emerging out of a private passion or private interest. They are active in a campaign a little time, and then it disperses. Huh? So this strong social movement, Amnesty, Greenpeace, these are the required organization and joint membership and these type of things, is on the fading. Well, it's not afforded by law. Swarming, as Joss Hans will talk about when we talk about that book later in another lecture. Now, so these are the main points, I think, of the book. The question then is how people leverage these affordances. And they focus on people's use, and this I completely agree with them. We have to focus on how people make use of these affordances rather than only look at the affordances in themselves. So the more these affordances are leveraged, the more the web or the people uses of the web will transform activism, they argue. So this is why this leverage, and on page 12 they have this, we can skip this, but you have this on page 12 where they discuss the different affordances concerning the e-mobilization, e-tactics, and e-movements. Now, what I want you to think about before we meet Friday is I want you to bring concrete examples of how the low-cost affordance on the internet is leveraged when it comes to participation and organization. Can you think of an example, good and bad ones, good examples or bad examples, and also for the second affordance here, how the reduced need for co-presence is leveraged when it comes to participation and organization. So I want you to think about this before and perhaps have a couple of examples with you, because you're going to use them in your presentations and in your work in the classroom. Because when you design your campaign in the group where you're in, you should account for how you consider these affordances that they present in the book. So I want you to really make use of them in your design choices for the campaign that you are designing. Um, so I want you to exemplify this with successful or deterrent or good or bad examples from existing campaigns, and you can take them down from the internet and show them on these boards that you're going to use in the classroom. So think about this before you come to the classroom. Now, okay, summary. This is a very good summary of the whole book, I think. On page 177, you find this. The affordances of reduced cost for participation, reduced cost for organizing, reduced need for physical togetherness in order to participate in collective actions, and reduced need for both collectivity and physical togetherness in organizing are critical to understand web activism. So this is what they say are the main points if you're going to talk about web activism and how the web transforms or informs activism. Now, and then throughout the book, they also make this differentiation between what they say is supersizing models or theory 2.0 theoretical models when it comes to the web here. So the effects of this can be supersized, or they can change the underlying dynamics of activism altogether. So what I mean by supersizing theoretical models are, I mean, for example, that the internet makes participation faster, wider, organization cheaper, but it doesn't really change the dynamics of activism. It accelerates processes, helps in reaching target audiences. For example, if you're an activist and want to reach certain audiences, or you want to circumvent government-imposed barriers, etc. So it helps in this, makes activism easier, but it doesn't really change activism. And this they contrast with this theory 2.0, 2.0 theories, where uses of the web changes the dynamics of activist participation in the beginning, or activist campaigns in the beginning. For example, it alters processes. You don't need a central leadership any longer, as they argue. I'm not so sure, but they argue that. No need of collective identity, which, I mean, Sylvain will talk about that also later, to act without being stigmatized. They say that this changes the dynamics of participation. So it can both change and just supersize or make activism easier. So this, I think, it's important to keep in mind as well. So social movements, yeah, and I guess the whole important to perhaps also say a couple of words on the whole starting point in the book is this critique against the resource mobilization theory, the idea that social movements or strong organizations are needed as resources, that this is not true any longer. And they exemplify this by 5 minutes activism, lone wolf organizers, or flash activism, and you can compare that to swarming, that we will talk about when we discuss Joss Hahn's book. So they critique the whole book, or this whole approach is a critique of resource mobilization theory, since resources no longer are as important. Now, this can of course be challenged. I mean, I think they are right in a certain point, but perhaps resources are not completely unimportant, but it becomes different. And their concluding chapter, and their concluding is that the conclusion of the book is that the web leads to a whole new digital repertoire of contention. So this is their concluding chapter. So what are we then going to do in the classroom? Well, I'm gonna divide you into 4 groups. You get 1 screen each in this group, and you're gonna decide upon a goal, a campaign within this group. I mean, perhaps there are some of you who are very interested in environmental activism. Some of you are very interested in political, some kind of political campaigning, etc. So you will be divided into this group. Within this group, you'll decide on a campaign, and it can just be something symbolic, and then you're gonna make design choices. You're gonna design a campaign based on these 4 affordances that Erlen Kimport strongly argues for in the book. So, but as I told you before, this you will do in class together. But before class, think about these examples, good or bad examples of these affordances that we've just been talking about, and that we can boil down this book to these 4 things or 2 things. So you have already examples with you when you come to the classroom, because we don't have so much time there. And then you will be divided into 4 groups. You will be divided before the class starts, so you will know which groups you are in. And then your job is to design this campaign. And you should exemplify your campaign choices or your campaign design choices. Therefore, you should think about these examples in advance. And you also, all your campaign choices also has to be justified and explained out of these affordances that Erling Kimport are arguing for in the book. So you're gonna apply these knowledges in a, well, in a real campaign, I was about to say, but in a campaign design. And then I know that you want to present for each other, so you should also prepare a very short 5-minute presentation, so at the end of the class we can listen to everyone. We will start 12:15 sharp. There will be a 5 minutes presentation of the technology, and we will have technological support throughout the class. And I will walk around in the groups, and there will be technological supports in the classroom. And if there is lot need for technological support, they will call in more people. So I think it's going to be exciting. So I look forward to the class, and see you. Bye.